We're hearing from Mark Lutz, our adjunct professor for this session of pastoring in the digital parish. My name is Ryan Dunn, and I'm excited to share the story of Lux Digital Church in this session. Mark Lutz is the, lead pastor of Lux Digital. He's going to share how this digital movement started with a passion, moved to a podcast, and then the podcast birthed the community that grew into an online expression of church. Lux Digital is a non-denominational church with an international footprint. They have a very clear multiplication strategy based on digital micro-communities that empower Jesus-centered influencers. I was drawn to learn more about Lux Digital because it seemingly started in such a haphazard way, with Mark starting a gaming podcast and finding that he could use that as a platform to both share faith and get people talking to one another. It's a story that we can learn from. So let's meet Pastor Mark Lutz. Well, in this session, we're going to get into the story of Lux Digital Church, which is a church committed to the belief that a digital church can successfully achieve all of the core functions that mark any effective, healthy church. And Mark Lutz is one of the founders of Lux Digital, and Mark has been a youth pastor, a discipleship pastor in kind of the traditional church setting. And Mark is an avid gamer who wanted to grow a spiritual community for like-minded people. And that community started with a podcast and has grown into something a whole lot more than that. We'll get into that story. Mark, how are you? Thank you so much for joining us.
I'm doing well, Ryan, and it's good to be here. It's good to be on the podcast, and Monday is my podcasting day, so we're recording this on a Monday.
Yep.
I record a show that covers a specific video game tonight, and we're actually launching a new podcast here in a couple of weeks, and moving our podcast to an umbrella network in March. And so we're recording our pilot episode 0 for that new show tonight as well. So I'm going to be triple recording podcast episodes today.
Right on. A lot of time in front of the mic. Well, let's kind of go big picture, and then we'll drill down into some of the specifics of your story. And in the big picture thing, like, what is your why for doing digital ministry? Like, why are you in the space that you're particularly in?
Sure. I think you have to start by, I think it's helpful for people to understand, because the natural tendency for the response to digital ministry by physical church, it typically is that's awful. It's a bad thing. It's going to destroy the church, right? We should not give up gathering together. And I believe all of those things, by the way. So just for all intents, just to understand, I never intended to start something online. I gamed in order to avoid people and decompress from people, not to connect with people. I didn't do online gaming because I wanted to be friends with a whole bunch of people on the internet. I didn't podcast for that reason either. And for me, before we planted Lux, I had been completely off the grid on social media, zero social media for 5 years. And so I was not the person to plant an online church. But as I say a lot right now, when you decide for Jesus to be your Savior and Lord, you don't get to have preferences anymore. He gets to decide what you're going to do. So big picture, why? I've been part of the gaming community for a really long time. My entire life, I've been a gamer to a certain extent. That's a big part of my story. I'm not exclusively a gamer, as all gamers are multifaceted people, but that is a part of who I am. And I was looking at this online world on a website called Twitch. It's owned by Amazon. It's the biggest live streaming platform, owns about 75% of live streaming on the internet. Just to give you an idea, about 100 million unique viewers visit their platform and watch streams. About 70% of those people are male. The average time watched is about 75 minutes a day. So that gives you a little bit of context for how many people are coming here, how many people are watching here. And I was watching guys like some of the bigger streamers who are streaming to 30, 40, 50, 80,000 people a day. And I was looking and I was saying, these people have more influence streaming to 80,000 people a day for 40 hours a week, have more influence over the coming generations than any pastor in America.
Yeah. And that's a lot of time with people. Yeah.
It's a lot of time with people. Their worldview is what's shaping Gen Z. And so I said, the church has to have a voice here, because what I saw was people desperately searching for truth anywhere they could find it. But there was absolutely nobody telling them the truth on this platform and in this space. Like, this is where the next generation is going to look for truth, but there's no one who's actually able to provide anything of lasting substance here. And so I was like, okay, well, there was all kinds of thought around, like, do we do an online evangelism? Do we, raise up YouTubers, streamers, content creators, podcasters to evangelize? What does that look like? And it sort of all became a yes together when we started dreaming about the digital church, which I can get into like a more detailed understanding, like why it became a church and not a mission organization, for example. But we might be able to get into that later. But the big heart was, I just saw people desperate for truth and had nobody there to point them in the right direction.
Yeah. Well, so it sounds like you started this whole thing through a podcast. What drew you to start the podcast?
I'll be honest. So I podcasted a little bit on and off. It's not up anymore. We used to run a podcast called Relevant Leadership, and we used that leadership podcast to train all of my youth leaders and people from our church. And then I ran a podcast called Fireside Talks, which is also dead, which was covering a video game. So I had a microphone. One day I was playing a video game and I wanted to go mow the grass and listen to a podcast about it. And I realized that no one was podcasting about it. So that night I grabbed my mic and I recorded a couple of solo show episodes talking about the game, started inviting people to come on the show. And I just had a simple prayer: God, redeem my love for gaming. Use it for your kingdom and whatever that looks like. So I just started offering to pray for people after we'd be done with the show. And, and God answered many of those prayers. And at the same time, I was reading Henry Blackaby's book, Experiencing God. And in it, he says, don't just do things and ask God to bless them, but look and see what God is doing and partner with him in what he's doing. And that really had a tremendous impact on my life. At the same time, there was a Buddhist, he called himself a Buddhist atheist. It's not a real thing, but I never had the heart to tell him that. I won't say his real name, but his screen name was Beefquake, and he reached out to me because he was listening to the show, and he said, I love what you're doing with the show. I think you could build a community around this. Can I help you do that? And through that community, I started evangelizing to people, praying for people, supporting people, counseling people, and mentoring people. And I began to see that these weren't just like temporary relationships where I saw someone post something on Facebook and we had a connection but no community. This group started spending a lot of time together to the point where there was genuine, profound life transformation happening in the lives of the people. And that's when the sort of like the keys came and the door unlocked for Digital Church. And I said, if you can disciple people like this in this type of a way, and I've never met them in person, then you can do a church without ever physically meeting in person. Because there are lives being transformed by the truth of Jesus and people being discipled inside this community, and they were from all across the globe. And that's really like the step that led to the step that led to the church that got planted out of the podcast. And then our launch team came out of the podcast. We just did a big call and we said, if there's any believers out there, I'm a pastor. I'm going to start an online church for gamers. And that's where we built our launch team, was people spread all over the globe who were believers listening to our show at the time.
Now, that's a cool story. You did a lot of things within that intrinsically that a lot of the rest of us are kind of struggling to figure out. So one of the big things is that when we come to podcasting, which is a great thing to do, it is a broadcast medium. So you have like one voice and a lot of ears, but there's not a whole lot of like dialogue happening on a broadcast medium like that. But it sounds like you had some things in place where you were able to enlist some other voices and hear the voices of your audience. So what was going on around that time where you were able to what made it possible for you to engage with your audience and hear their voices and start to build community around the podcast?
There's something beautiful about content creation in the fact that people who consume the content naturally want to draw closer to the content creator, right? You get this, you get this point of respect and this place of privilege inside of people's lives who listen to you. And you're a real, you're just a normal dude. Like, I didn't know anything more about this game. I wasn't even particularly good about it. I was just willing to talk about it. So really what we did was two things. One, we opened up a Discord, that if you don't know what Discord is, it's kind of like a Slack or team building app, but it originated and was birthed through the gaming community. Is originally like a voice chat option for, video game play and stuff. And it has become something much more robust and significant than that. And, really, really, really great community building tool now. Really powerful. So that just allowed me to get instant access to people from my community. Then at the end of our show, which was a secular show about a video game, I did something called Closing Thoughts. And it would be like a 5-minute segment where I would share biblical wisdom without sharing any of the Bible. And that was starting to impact people's lives, and people were starting to leave us podcast reviews saying that it was impacting their lives. And I was like, well, that's cool. So I started at the end of the show just saying, I am a voice who's here to listen. My goal is to be a light in the gaming community. If you need someone to talk to, just know that I'm willing to listen. And I started counseling people through divorces. I started helping people who were battling depression. I started, mentoring new fathers. And it was just because I opened myself up and said, I don't want you to just listen to me. I want to build relationships with the community. And here, message me on Discord or email me. Here's my email. And I started getting people's phone numbers, and they started calling me, and I started, building relationships that way as well, praying with people over the phone, texting members of my community. And so just making myself available meant that people were willing to take that.
Okay.
Not everybody, but some people.
Right. Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Well, you had this community around the podcast. How did that transition then into being a ministry and a church?
Well, it was a ministry from the beginning in the fact that, I knew what I wanted to do with it was, and listen, if you have any sort of a platform, even if you don't have a platform, everything that you do in your life is a ministry, right?
Yeah, thanks for calling that out.
Yeah, we have this nasty thing in the church where we split, church life from the rest of our life. And so, and video game world does that too. They talk about IRL, in real life, or video game world. The reality is it's all in real life. Yes, the fantasy world that you're playing in might not be real, but you're really spending your real life in it. So there's that. When it became a church, it was 2019, the end of 2019. I took a walk with a dog, and God said in that prayer time, which I don't really hear from the voice of God often. And if I had told you that, I would have said 70% chance it was God's voice. But typically when God tells you to do something crazy that you wouldn't have thought of on your own, it tends to be his voice. And so I thought I heard, Mark, I want you to start an online church, to which I responded, that's heretical. And so I was like, nope, not going to do that, because God doesn't speak contrary to his word. But the Holy Spirit has a way of being relentless as well. And so over the next several weeks, as I would take the dog for a walk, that was the only thing the Holy Spirit wanted to talk about, was this online church. And the Holy Spirit started walking me through scriptures and saying, don't give up gathering together. And I was like, okay. And the Holy Spirit was like, how have you not been gathering with these people? It's like, okay, I've certainly have been gathering with them. Devote yourselves to prayer, to the apostles' teachings. And it's like, well, I'm now seeing that we could actually do those things. And when my mind went to that, and I realized that so many of my preconceived ideas about church were just what I was comfortable with. It didn't mean that it was necessary for church. It's just I liked potlucks in the fellowship hall. It made me happy. Right? Yeah. It's I like that. But the reality was there was thousands, millions of people living within driving distance of great churches with amazing potlucks that were never, ever showing up. And they were going to go to hell because we never went to where they were, because they don't care about our potluck or our padded seats or our killer worship band or our charismatic preacher, whatever it is. They just don't care. And so it was okay, if I gave up what I like about church and instead went to the Bible and saw what it said about what the church needed to be, is online out of the question. And that's when I began to unpack theologically, ecclesiology-wise. No. There's things that are more difficult. There's things that are easier. And I would even as the pastor of a digital church, I'll tell you physical's better. But it's not going to be for everybody.
Gotcha. When you were first having some of the reservations about hearing that voice calling you to start a digital church, you actually thought it was heretical. Were there specific ideas or notions or theological arguments that you had in mind that led you to think that the online expression was heretical?
Sure. Things like I had said over and over again, God's plan A is the local church, and God doesn't make plan Bs. Okay. And I was like, I believe that's true, but I also cannot find anything in the Bible that says the local church. It was
Right,
like,
yeah.
and I looked and I would say the things that we're doing as a church are biblical. You know, our 3 songs, our offering moment, our announcements, our sermon, our one song, our benediction, and then I would look in the Bible and it would be like, well, actually, the Bible's pretty vague about what the New Testament church looked like outside of the things that they devoted themselves to.
Yeah.
And so when I stopped imagining church as my experience and justifying my experience by just claiming that it was biblical, and I'm not saying that what we do in the physical church is not biblical. I think it's great. It's beautiful. It's wonderful. And I love it. And I'm still part of a local physical church. My family still goes there. I take my daughters there. All of that to say, I just, when I wasn't imagining it by my preference, I realized that the scriptures and the teachings of God's word and what the church was, is more open-ended than what I thought it was. And we can read a lot of things into the Bible. And I say this a lot. I said the Bible was written for you, but it wasn't written to you. The Bible, the passages of where the New Testament letters were written to the churches in Galatia, and they were written to the churches in Corinth, right? And believe it or not, the church in Corinth didn't have the internet. Neither did any of the churches in Galatia, right? They didn't have electricity. But you can't tell me that if Paul had the opportunity to tell the churches in Galatia to kick out the Judaizers over a Zoom call instead over a messenger and a written letter, that he wouldn't have chosen the Zoom call. Yep. Paul would have chosen the Zoom call, right? And so sometimes we read into the Bible our preconceived sort of what we prefer instead of what's actually there. And we make assumptions about what the Bible would say about modern tech and the connectiveness that it can have without ever actually critically thinking about it or examining it.
Well, as you started to build up Lux Digital as its own kind of, there I use the word brand, but as its own separate entity from what had been before with the podcast, you mentioned that some things were going to be easier and some things were going to be more challenging. What were some of those initial challenges that you faced?
Well, we had to cross the bridge of sacraments, and that was one of the hardest bridges for us. We were like, this can't be a church if we cannot be part, if the sacraments can't happen amongst us, right? Mm-hmm. And so I come from a non-denominational evangelical church background. So, I'm not Roman Catholic, and I realize, there's some definitive theology around the Roman Catholic Church and some of the other, the Eastern Orthodox Church that makes the digital church not a church, and I get that. For me, coming from the background that I came from, I thought, we can actually do the Lord's Supper even if I'm not, do I really believe that my hands are so important that if I had laid them on the bread and the juice, that it makes it more significant? Because I don't know a single pastor, at least in my experience, that laid his hands on every piece of bread and juice and wafer that went out to the congregation. So if I'm not already doing that and I'm not the one personally handing it to people, what's the difference between them getting grape juice and a slice of bread in their house and them getting a wafer and a little cup of juice at my physical church? And there isn't one, as long as it's done in the right spirit. So we do Lord's Supper every month here at Lux. And then the next one for us was baptism. What does that look like? And that was a significant obstacle at first. And so at Lux, we do baptism one of 3 ways. We recommend you go to a local physical congregation first to be baptized. And I will actually reach out to and talk with the local pastor if you've given your life to Jesus and shown proof of that. The next one is if you don't have a local physical congregation, which we have people who don't, it's to be baptized by a believing family member or friend. I'll train them in baptizing you, and then you have to film it and share it with the church family because it has to be a public proclamation of faith to your spiritual family. And the last option, we actually have a guy like this. He had no one in his entire life. He grew up conservative Muslim. He left the faith as a teenager, came to faith at our church as a college student, and has never had a friend or family member that's a believer. And so he actually has 2 atheists that are going to baptize him. And I am going to be on a Zoom call with him, declaring Father, Son, and Holy Spirit as they dunk him, and then pray over them. And so that's kind of like our third option. And once again, that's recorded and then shared with our church family during a service.
Okay. All right. So the church is still, in a way, shape, and form, a participant within the Second. That's cool. Okay.
Yep. That's okay. I mean, there are other hard elements to it. You don't bump into people from your church in the grocery store like you would a physical church. So relationships are possible, but they have to be more intentional. Vision doesn't rub off of you just by the way that you walk through the church building or that post-service interactions that you have with people. Vision has to be more intentionally passed down. And sort of like the way in which you train people, you just have to be more intentional across the board with everything. So I do a lot more time on voice chats and video chats and hanging out with my church family, because nothing is going to happen accidentally to make it happen, right? Like you have to be intentional and purposeful in it. So that's a big difference. That has been a big change for us.
So how are you going out and intentionally meeting new people in the digital space?
That's a great question. So we stream our services is held on Twitch, and that's where our community meets. And if you come to one of our services, you'll notice it's unlike any other. You'll probably be picturing like, well, our online service is on Facebook and two people say something the whole time. That is not the case with our church. So like, because I don't have an in-person group, like my first 15 minutes, we're cracking jokes, we're hanging out, we're welcoming people in. It's me and my wife on a couch. We go through announcements, we talk with our community. My sermon, I'm interacting with the community and I'm talking to them. They're participating in our teaching time. Post-service, I'm hanging out with the community. I'm answering their questions that they have about the scriptures that we talked about that night. So there's a lot of interaction. And so for us, like it's not uncommon for us to have 75% of the people who are in service actively participating in the service. So it looks very different than your average broadcast ministry. We're not a broadcast ministry, we're a digital church. And so the way that we meet new people is the fact that people can come in and just stumble into our stream. We're in the just chatting category every Wednesday night, but mostly we grow like every other church grows, which is word of mouth. Like people invite people. Their lives are transformed by Jesus. They experience the power of the Spirit. They're growing in their faith. They're being discipled and finding community. And so they just naturally invite other people in. And because we're ministering to digital natives, people who, like there's people in our church who the first time they met the best men in their wedding was on their wedding day. But they had been gaming with them from across the country for 12 years.
Yeah.
And the relationship was significant enough that that person was in their wedding. And so, like, most of the people in my community have relationships like that. People they've never met in person, but they have hung out with online for years. And so people invite people like that in.
Okay. And then how do you go about doing some of the discipling activity? For example, Lux Digital on your website, you say that you have small groups going. What do small groups look like for Lux Digital?
Well, small groups look like just about the same as any other small group would look like with the absence of food. I mean, sometimes we do eat together, but, our small groups look like everybody else's small group did during COVID-19 in 2020. Okay. Now, you might have an experience with that and be like, oh, that stinks. I don't like that because it was horrible for me and I didn't like going to that small group, blah, blah, blah. But that is usually people who aren't digital natives. My people are digital natives. My church family doesn't use the internet as a tool. They live part of their lives there. They are in voice chats, in video chats every single night, hanging out and gaming with people. And so that's just part of their rhythms. So when I invite them into a small group, like my Monday night group, which I hold every Monday night, we're meeting here in a couple of hours. It's like one of the most life-giving parts of my week. It's so hard to get our group of guys just to calm down and quit laughing and cracking jokes long enough to get into something serious. It's not this awkward thing. We have to cut it short at 2 hours sometimes. And at times I leave to go podcast at night and they're still in there until midnight, just hanging out and chatting together and sharing life together. And we're having guys who are coming out of serious addiction issues, people who are finding accountability. My group actually came together and paid for professional counseling for one of our guys who are in my group. Okay, this dude lives in Iowa. There's nobody that lives within 15 hours of this guy in my group. Part of our group's outside the country. Canadians. I have several Canadians in our group. And so, we all pulled together finances to support him and pay for counseling because he was going through a really hard time. And so, we're sacrificing for one another, providing meals for each other. Yeah, I can't, bake something and bring it to your house. But we've literally ordered DoorDash from 6 states away and had it delivered at one of our church members' houses to cover a meal that night because someone had surgery or someone had a baby. And so what technology allows us to do is enables us to care for one another, although many of us are separated by thousands of miles.
And just out of curiosity, what platform are you using for small groups?
We've used different things. Right now, most of our small groups are held in Discord, so we'll be in voice chat rooms or private calls. We have used Right Now Media, so we have a partnership with Right Now Media. They're a great resource. We got to hang out with them in Nashville this past year, and they gifted us and our entire church 2 years of Right Now Media. And so we have held, when we do video-based small groups, we've held them in there. Like this new small group season that starts this week, that's going for 10 weeks is based around the messages. So we'll actually write small group questions and send them out to our leaders. And then those leaders will, use those questions in conversation. A lot of our small groups about building community, though, because the online world can be cold. And so it's really important that small groups are part of the DNA of who we are, a robust part of it from the very beginning, because that's how people build deeper connection, is once you get into a video chat scenario.
Okay. You talked about your small group coming together to give some financial support to somebody. Is it too meddlesome to ask how Lux Digital is getting financial support?
Yeah, no, it's not too invasive at all. So I mean, we raise support just like anybody else. So like any other church plant. So when you start a church, if you're church planting with a denomination, a lot of time that denomination, I don't know how the UMC does it, but I know like the Christian Missionary Alliance, like a lot of times they'll pay everything for the first couple of years.
Yeah.
When you're planting a church like a non-denominational church or an independent church, that comes through fundraising and a lot of work and strategic partnerships. And so, we have a tithe and offering opportunity in each of our services. We do have people from our church who do give faithfully, but we are less than a year in. So we are, of course, not sufficient. Like, we're not self-supporting yet, although we hope. It usually takes a church 3 to 5 years to be self-supporting. I would think that we'll be there in 5, based on kind of like what we're seeing and how we're seeing giving growing. But right now, we have a partnership with Saddleback. We have a partnership with our sending church, New Life Christian Ministries here in Saxonburg, Tomoka in Florida, Open Door in North Carolina, a handful of others. And then one of our more recent ones is Rivers Crossing in Cincinnati. We're one of their 10 and 10 now. And so it's like 10 churches in 10 years that they're helping start. And so like those partnerships do a lot to help fund us.
Okay. And then what about support? You said that it was kind of a lonely space in the beginning, that there weren't a whole lot of people doing what you were doing in that digital space. Have you found a community of digital ministers that you're connected with?
So, yes, I have. Yes and no. So, church planting in general is lonely. And a lot of the things that are true of church planting are true of digital church planting as well. There's not like, I think people think like it's this completely different thing and it requires and I can't do it. Like, I'm not a digitally bent person. So I'm using all of the same skills, giftings, and tools that I had in physical ministry. I'm just preaching to a camera with souls behind that screen, right? Those people still count. Just because they're looking at a screen doesn't mean they stop being real people with real souls really made in the image of God. And I think that's the hardest thing for most people to comprehend, is they see a screen name and they immediately dehumanize the person. They don't realize that person has a story and a family and a faith narrative, and that their story deeply matters, and they have questions that need answering and deserve to be answered. So my community originally, I went through Stadia Church Planting. Those are the people who helped launch us. We were their first official digital church plant that actually launched. I went through with 2 others, the folks from King City Church with Chesley and Beverly Lundy, and then Chris and Christy Monroe, who lead Relate Church on Facebook. But I also got connected with DJ Soto, who pastors VR Church, and Angela Craig, who did pastor Pursuit Church Live on Facebook. And then Jeff Reed, who leads the Church Digital podcast. He's like the godfather of digital church stuff in this season. So,
okay. Well, in looking for the future of 2022, like, what do you see happening next, both within Lux Digital Church, but also within kind of digital church in general?
With Lux Digital Church, we have a lot of dreams for what this next year is going to look like. And our big push right now is like to get our people and build the culture and the mindset that we're not just creating, like any other church should be, we're not just creating a comfortable place for Christians to come to. We've been very clear from the beginning. This isn't just some Christian gaming community where you can find other Christian friends who don't cuss. Like, we are on mission to reach people, which means we are going to have very messy people in our church. And we have very messy people who are calling Lux home and who are not followers of Jesus, but who are interested in the church and the teachings of Jesus. And so a big thing that, like, one of our core values at Lux, all of our core values are something is greater than something else. So one of our core values is 1 is greater than 99. And that's a big push for us this year, is you finding your one. Who's your one person? It's not about saying, but who is your one? And how can you reach your one? And how can we equip you and pray for you and help you in that pursuit of reaching and discipling that one? And so that's a big push for us this year. I don't know what the digital church is going to look like in 2022. It just seems to me that there was a lot of churches that were really gung-ho about it in 2020, and then 2021 rolled around, and they're like, whew, we can go back to our buildings. We can forget about all this stuff that I didn't want to learn to begin with. And then there are these offshoots of like people who were on those teams who saw the potential and are deeply saddened by the fact that none of their leadership did. And their leadership was all gung-ho and behind them until the day that they were allowed to reopen their doors and bring people back into their church. And they just totally forgot about the people that they were reaching who can't physically get to their building. And they've just been pushed to the side. And so what I'm seeing is a lot of people who are coming out of that and saying, God's at work in my life. He's working on my heart. And now the only way to start a digital church is for me to leave the church family that I love. And so I'm hoping that 2022 we see a shift and we see some people who are leading physical churches who will reevaluate and begin sending digital planters. Because I'll tell you this, the harvest is plentiful, but the workers are few in this space. Like, there's lots of people. It's not a small amount. It's a tremendous number of people. And we don't have the time or resources to be able to reach them. We need physical churches to kind of get in the game and realize that the digital church is not a threat to them. We're reaching a completely different demographic and type of person. People that would never come to their church.
I think that's a great distinction, that this is not kind of a replacement for anything that's previously come before, but this is kind of a next level expression. Yeah.
No, this is an extension of what the physical church is. Like, the reality is there, like, I live in rural Western Pennsylvania, right? There is almost nobody from my town of 1,200 that are going to come and call my church their home. Very, very few. So we need physical churches because the majority of people, if they want a faith expression, are still going to go to a physical church to find that. However, there is enough people who will not, that would engage digitally, that a digital church don't just make sense. They're necessary. Because there's enough people that will never come physically. And we do send some, like, there's some people who come to our church, they come to faith, and we're like, we love you, we want to bless you, but you need to go find a physical church. Because they're physically church-minded people. Like, they need the physical accountability. There's some people that's not the case. There's some people that come in and we're like, nope, we can be the full expression of the church for this person, and they can grow in their faith and really live on mission where they are physically connected to us digitally. But there are some folks who are just like, maybe a physical church would be good for you, and we'll even help them find that home, wherever they are in the world.
That's great. Well, for somebody who wants to come in and check out Lux Digital Church at kind of the entry level, the opening of the funnel, like, where might be the best place for them to engage?
Yeah, sure. So, I think that there will be a lot of people who listen to this podcast who are from the Methodist Church that want to know, like, hopefully there's pastors that want to know what your theology is like, right? And so you really want to know that, like, Lux Digital Church or youtube.com/Lux Digital Church. You can watch all of our sermons there. If you want to get links out to where we are, luxdigitalchurch.com. That will give you out to our YouTube, our Instagram, our TikTok, and we can get into that. Not all of those are places where we exist as a church. Some of those are just front doors for us that allow people to find us and come in.
Right.
But you can also find a link out to our, like, where our church is, like our Twitch page is our sanctuary. Like that's, picture your church. You have a worship center, and then you have the rest of the building, the bathrooms and the coffee station and the children's ministry and the small group rooms and the Sunday school and all of the welcome center, all that stuff. All of the rest of the stuff that isn't our sanctuary is in Discord. Like that's the rest of our physical building. Our blueprint exists there, but our sanctuary is on Twitch, and you can find us every Wednesday night at 8:30 p.m. EST. We go live at 8:20. We say the doors open at 8:20. The service starts at 8:30. Twitch.tv/Lux, Lux Digital Church, Wednesday night. And if you create an account, you can follow us and chat with us. Just come in and say, hey, hello, I'm coming from the podcast, and we'll be there talking to you.
Cool. Well, I'm glad you brought that up because in our minds, from a traditional church standpoint, a lot of us think in terms of like, we want to meet people in the community. We want to invite them to be a part of our community through worship. And then we want to enter a relationship with them in a small group, right? And we all have kind of geographic locations where that happens, the community, the sanctuary, and then, either the home or like a Sunday school room or something like that. In your mind, are there specific platforms like that for Lux Digital? Like you're meeting people on Twitch or meeting people in social media and coming to Twitch and then going to Discord?
Yeah. So, I mean, we're meeting people on social media, on TikTok, on Instagram. We're meeting people on Twitch. I live stream. I streamed 3 hours this morning. So I live stream every Monday, Wednesday, Friday in the morning on my own personal Twitch page. And I always invite people into church. We have multiple members of our church family who also live stream and do podcasting and content creation because it's a hobby and it's fun. Yeah. And they invite people to come into Lux as well. So those are all sort of front doors for us into the community that we're engaging with. And then word of mouth. And then, so Twitch is our sanctuary. That's where people, you know what? It's not even necessarily where people come first. Like we have more people who join us in Discord and then we invite them to come to church with us and they come to church with us there. But just like any other church has an engagement pathway or sort of a funnel, we do too. Our funnel in the end is, so we believe everything that is digital goes physical and everything physical goes digital, right? Every one of us are a digital being in some capacity. If you have a smartphone and you look at email, you are a digital being in some capacity. I just happen to be more digital than you are probably. If you're listening to this podcast, you experience things digitally. So, for us, what our long-term hope and dream is to plant a dispersed network of house churches all across the globe. So as God sends us leaders who are apostolic in nature, we raise those leaders up. We'll train them through missionary training to engage in their physical communities and invite people into their home to pastor those communities, baptize people, lead in communion, all of those things. So they'll be connected through a web of digital church family and digital resources, but they'll actually be discipling communities of 10 to 12 inside their homes where they raise up new leaders and plants. Hopefully one day, there's hundreds of nerds who are gathered behind their computers all across the globe, but hopefully there's also, our church in Moscow, our house church in South Africa, 3 house churches in rural Missouri, a house church in LA, 5 house churches in New York City, who have been raised up and they have all of the DNA built into them to not just be a church, but also to plant. And they're connected through the theological covering and the resources of our digital home base. And so we believe that we'll go physical eventually just through a dispersed house church network that can be global and can span all languages, which we're really excited about. We can literally raise up like in-country missionaries from anywhere in the globe through modern tech, which is really exciting.
Oh, that's a great vision. Yeah. Good way of looking at it. Well, Mark, thank you so much for sharing the story of Lux Digital Church with us and your story in coming into this realm as well. It's really refreshing for a lot of us to hear, like, you weren't quite down with it at the beginning. So, as a lot of us have found ourselves in the digital ministry realm with similar stories. So it's awesome to hear that you kind of came from that place and have continued to thrive in this space. Thanks so much for participating in this session of Pastoring in the Digital Parish. You're going to want to click over to luxdigital.com to check out Lux Digital Church, the latest from Pastor Mark. Pastoring in the Digital Parish is a resource from resourceumc.org, the online destination for leaders throughout the United Methodist Church. We're going to have a new session next week, but in the meantime, if you want to explore more on starting a digital movement, then check out our Holy Mischief episode with Shannon Carafonda. Or to get into some of the gaming tech that Mark mentioned, then listen to our Discord episode with Nathan Webb or our Twitch session with David Petty and Russell Dornish. Both of those are helpful. This has been fun. My name is Ryan Dunn. If you have a question or suggestion for the podcast, send me an email at digitalparish@umcom.org. Thank you, and I'll talk with you soon.